So I want to look at the Messner and Musto 2014 article, Where Are the Kids? And this article talks about how there's a lack of attention and research given to the underside of the iceberg of youth who participate in sports. And one reason that it's difficult to categorize who even plays sports is because of differing levels of competition and organization. It's important to study youth sports as active subjects who create their own social worlds, meaning that we can't really focus on research into kids' sports as adults. We need to look at it as kids. And they also give 5 good potential topics of research, ideas into future research, and those are kids who don't play sports, kids' experience of play, kids as sport consumers, which I think is super interesting, kids' sport and social inequalities, and then kids' health and injuries. So first of all, the article talks about the implications of studying youth sports from the, quote, demographic buoyancy for the future of sport perspective, which they say on page 106, versus the active subjects who create their own social worlds perspective, which is talked about on page 107. And they're arguing, they're just saying, be careful not to focus too much on youth sport as it relates to the future of sport, rather than looking at youth sport, kids sport, just simply as kids sport from the eyes of the kids. What does it look like from the kids' perspective? Not what does it look like from the future of our economy or what sports might look like in the future. Let's maybe not be so future focused, but instead look on the kids' experience as it is today. And you know, one of the ideas of this future focused orientation looks exactly as at what we looked at last week with what sports do to promote positive development of youth. We looked at that with our high school readings, didn't we, as far as what adults expect high school sports to provide to youth and students. So, you know, looking at what sports provide kids. So that's one of those future-focused orientations, which is fine to study, but let's also bring it back down to the kids' social context and look at what they see with it. So one of the interesting things that this article mentions in looking at the specific perspective of kids is that gaining access to the social world of children is challenging in and of itself. So imagine that you, as an adult researcher, go in and try to observe a bunch of children playing sports. Well, they're going to automatically stop and look at you as an adult. And that's going to change the way that they play with each other or interact with each other or you. So just gaining access to the social context of kids without intervening as an adult and looking at that authentic behavior without the atmosphere of authority that happens when adults are present is kind of a challenge in looking at sport from the pure perspective of a kid. I thought that was a really interesting point about why it's hard to study youth sport. I loved this article because it brings up some really interesting trends and ideas for future questions. And one was in examining why kids don't play sports. Why is it dangerous to assume that we always want kids to play sports? Does that put the non-sporty kids into a bad frame, like lazy or dropouts? You know, not necessarily. It's not always about access, whether or not kids have the opportunity to play sports. We shouldn't assume that no access isn't the only reason that kids don't play. Understanding other reasons why kids may not play sports is important to us understanding sports in general as an institution in our culture. Is it some aspect of competition that some kids don't like, or maybe a bad experience with a coach, or some other aspect of sport culture that kids didn't like? That's important to our general understanding of sport, rather than just looking at access and assuming that everyone wants to play. We also see the further quandary of what is sport versus what is play, and what should each one be. So what's the role of organized youth sports in providing these? And in the Davies article this week, we see the criticism of Little League because it takes away the spontaneous and creative elements of play. Yet in this article, we see these ideas of formalizing play creeping into fundamentally unorganized or anti-established activities like skateboarding. So I think that's a really interesting way of examining what sport is, what sport should be, and how it may or may not be related to play, and whether we want to formally organize play, especially in unorganized sports like skateboarding, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at some of our fringe sports in society. Another idea is that we see the idea of youth sports not only in a participant context, but also in a spectator context as consumers. So in looking at sport consumers as kids, what may kids get out of wearing their favorite team jersey? Do they use it to build their own peer communities? Maybe. And then another idea about research that was brought up in this article is, how do we treat gender? Do we see sex-segregated sports reinforce gender segregation and gender hierarchies? Or might we see sex-segregated sports as pushing females away from participating? So two very different ideas on segregating sports by gender. One in which it may reinforce gender segregation, and then one where it may further segregate or further push away genders from participating, and that's not the intended effect. So some interesting ideas in looking at the gender idea of youth sports. So I hope you enjoyed these youth sports readings. I know I did, and we will see you next week.